He said the restaurant was his family's legacy. My name was on the business license the whole time. I want to start with that sentence, because for 8 years, I helped build something from a single struggling storefront into one of the most successful Italian restaurants in our entire region, only to watch my husband and his family spend the final months of our marriage trying to convince everyone, including me, that I had simply been helping out the whole time, rather than being exactly what the actual paperwork always said I was. I want to tell you how I finally reminded everyone what that paperwork actually said, because I think if you've ever poured years of genuine foundational work into something only to have it quietly minimized once things fell apart, you already understand exactly the kind of clarity I eventually needed to reclaim. Hello, and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about the work that goes unrecognized until the exact moment it becomes inconvenient for someone else to keep recognizing it, and the specific, undeniable proof that eventually sets the record straight. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, I hope you'll stay until the end, because I think the way this one resolves might surprise you. My name is Sofia. I am 36 years old, and 8 years ago, my husband Antonio and I opened a small Italian restaurant together, a business we built from nothing into something genuinely successful, before our eventual divorce revealed exactly how differently he and his family had always privately understood my role within it. I want to tell you about how the restaurant actually began, because I think understanding the genuine foundational nature of my involvement from the very first day matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Antonio and I met in culinary school, both of us pursuing degrees with genuine passion, though our specific interests diverged in ways that would eventually complement each other perfectly. Antonio focused intensively on cooking technique, dreaming, even in those early student years, of one day running his own kitchen. I focused more on the business and hospitality side, restaurant management, finance, the specific operational discipline required to keep a small independent restaurant genuinely profitable in an industry notorious for thin margins and high failure rates. I remember, specifically, the class where Antonio and I first properly met, a joint seminar combining students from both the culinary and hospitality management tracks, paired together for a semester-long project developing a complete concept for a hypothetical restaurant. Antonio brought fierce, genuine enthusiasm to every menu discussion, sketching plating concepts on napkins during our late-night planning sessions, while I found myself, almost naturally, taking the lead on our project's financial projections and operational logistics, a division of labor that felt, even then, like an easy, complementary partnership rather than any kind of imposed hierarchy. We married 3 years after graduating, and for the following 2 years, we both worked at other restaurants, gaining experience, saving money, and slowly developing the specific business plan that would eventually become our own restaurant, a plan we worked on together, literally, at our kitchen table most evenings. Antonio sketching menu concepts while I built detailed financial projections and researched potential locations. I remember those evenings vividly. Our small apartment kitchen table covered in spreadsheets and hand-drawn floor plans. Antonio testing recipes on our modest home stove while I researched commercial lease terms and small business loan requirements. Both of us equally exhausted after our own separate restaurant shifts, but genuinely energized by the shared work of building something that felt, even in those early planning stages, like it belonged fully to both of us. I want to tell you about the specific work that went into actually opening our restaurant, because I think this foundational period matters enormously for understanding exactly how genuinely equal our partnership was from its very inception, regardless of how that history was later selectively remembered. We found our location, a small storefront in a slowly gentrifying neighborhood, through my own persistent research and negotiation, spending nearly 4 months touring available properties before finally settling on a space with genuine potential. Despite its considerable need for renovation, I personally negotiated our initial lease terms, drawing on skills I'd developed through several business courses during my culinary school years, securing terms considerably more favorable than the landlord's initial asking price. I remember that specific negotiation process vividly, sitting across from our eventual landlord, an older, skeptical man who had clearly negotiated with countless hopeful young restaurateurs before us, most of whose ventures, he told me candidly during our first meeting, had failed within their first 2 years. I remember the specific satisfaction of eventually winning his confidence, presenting him with a detailed business plan I had built myself, complete with realistic financial projections and a clear operational strategy that convinced him, gradually over several meetings, that our venture carried genuine potential for long-term success, rather than the familiar pattern of failure he'd witnessed so often before. Antonio attended some of these negotiation meetings alongside me, but I want to be honest that the actual persuasive work, the specific financial arguments and lease term negotiations, were conducted almost entirely by me, a fact our landlord himself would occasionally acknowledge years later, greeting me specifically by name whenever he stopped by the restaurant to collect rent. I want to describe the specific financial structure we established when we formally opened the restaurant, because this structure, established with full deliberate intention at the very beginning, would eventually become the single most important piece of evidence in everything that followed. We formed a formal limited liability company, filed with our state's Secretary of State office, with Antonio and me listed as equal 50% owners, a structure our own attorney at the time specifically recommended given that we were both contributing substantial capital, labor, and expertise to the business's formation. I remember signing those formation documents together, at our attorney's office, both of us genuinely excited, understanding that we were building something together, as full and equal partners, regardless of the different specific roles we would each take on in the business's actual day-to-day operations. I remember that specific afternoon at our attorney's office with unusual clarity, the particular quality of late afternoon light through his office window, Antonio's hand finding mine under the conference table as we waited for the final documents to print, both of us barely able to contain our excitement at formally, legally becoming co-owners of something we had spent nearly 2 years carefully planning together. Our attorney, an older methodical man named Frank Delgado who had handled small business formations for decades, specifically walked us through the equal ownership structure, explaining in detail exactly what 50% ownership legally entitled each of us to, a conversation I remember Antonio nodding along to with what appeared to be genuine, full understanding and agreement at the time. I remember Frank specifically asking us both, individually, whether we understood and agreed to the equal ownership structure before finalizing the documents, a standard practice, he explained, to ensure both parties entered the agreement with full clarity and consent. Antonio answered without hesitation, telling Frank he wanted nothing less than a fully equal partnership with me, words I would find myself recalling years later with a specific, painful irony, holding a letter from an entirely different attorney characterizing that same equal partnership as merely operational assistance. I want to tell you about those specific roles, because I think understanding the genuine division of labor matters enormously for understanding exactly how unfair the later minimization of my contribution actually was. Antonio ran the kitchen, developing and refining our menu, managing our kitchen staff, maintaining the specific culinary standards that would eventually earn our restaurant considerable local acclaim and recognition. This was genuinely important, skilled work, and I want to be clear that I never once diminished the value of what Antonio specifically contributed to our restaurant's eventual success. But I managed everything else. I handled all of our financial operations, bookkeeping, payroll, vendor negotiations, tax filings, the entire complex financial infrastructure that keeps a restaurant actually solvent regardless of how good the food itself might be. I managed our front-of-house operations, hiring and training our serving staff, handling reservation systems, managing the specific customer relationships that build genuine repeat business over years, rather than simply months. I handled our marketing and community outreach, building the restaurant's local reputation through careful, sustained relationship building with food critics, local business associations, and community organizations. I remember specifically the painstaking process of hiring and training our very first serving staff, conducting dozens of interviews myself, developing a detailed training program covering everything from wine pairing suggestions to handling difficult customer complaints, a program several of our later, more established competitors eventually asked to study, given our restaurant's consistently strong reputation for genuinely excellent service. I remember building relationships with local food critics one careful lunch meeting at a time, understanding, from my own hospitality training, exactly how much a restaurant's long-term success depends on this kind of patient, sustained community cultivation rather than simply excellent food alone. Antonio would occasionally join these meetings, charming and genuinely engaging in his own right, but the actual strategic groundwork, identifying which critics to prioritize, understanding exactly what each publication's readership actually valued, was work I conducted almost entirely independently, research and relationship building, that occurred largely outside Antonio's direct daily awareness, precisely because it fell so clearly within my own specific area of professional expertise. I want to tell you about our restaurant's early years because they required, from both of us, genuinely exhausting, sustained commitment that I think matters for understanding exactly how much we both actually sacrificed to build something that eventually became successful. Those first 2 years were financially precarious in the way most new restaurants genuinely are, both of us working 60 and 70-hour weeks, foregoing any meaningful salary for ourselves while we reinvested nearly every dollar of revenue back into the business, gradually improving our kitchen equipment, expanding our dining room, building the careful, patient reputation that would eventually allow us to become genuinely profitable. I remember specific nights during those early years, closing the restaurant well past midnight, Antonio and I sitting together at one of our own dining room tables, exhausted, reviewing the day's receipts by the dim light of the closed restaurant, calculating whether we could afford a needed equipment repair or whether it would need to wait another month. I remember one particularly difficult stretch during our second year, when a walk-in refrigerator failure threatened significant spoiled inventory losses, right as we were already stretched thin on cash flow, and how Antonio and I worked through that crisis together, him personally researching emergency repair options late into the night, while I called every vendor we worked with, negotiating temporary payment extensions to keep us financially afloat until the immediate crisis passed. I remember that specific week with unusual clarity, spending nearly 6 hours on the phone across 2 days, calling every single one of our produce, meat, and dairy suppliers individually, explaining our temporary cash flow constraint honestly, and negotiating, one difficult conversation at a time, short extensions on our payment terms that ultimately gave us just enough breathing room to cover the refrigerator repair without missing a single scheduled shift or disappointing a single reservation. I remember Antonio thanking me repeatedly that week, telling me, more than once, that he genuinely didn't know how the restaurant would have survived that crisis without my specific financial negotiating skills. A genuine, heartfelt acknowledgement that I found myself returning to, with considerable bitterness. Years later, when his own attorney's letter characterized my financial contributions as merely operational management. Those genuinely difficult, shared struggles built something between us that I believed, at the time, was an unbreakable foundation, evidence of exactly how equally and completely we were both invested in this business's survival and eventual success. I want to tell you about Antonio's family, because understanding their specific relationship to the restaurant and their specific assumptions about my role within it matters enormously for everything that eventually happened during our divorce. Antonio's mother, Carmela, and his younger brother Dante had always maintained a particular, persistent narrative about the restaurant that I understood, throughout most of our marriage, as simply an affectionate, if somewhat imprecise, way of talking about a family business, rather than anything I felt necessary to formally correct. Carmela, in particular, frequently referred to the restaurant as Antonio's legacy, a specific phrase she used consistently at family gatherings, in conversations with friends even, occasionally in brief interviews with local publications covering the restaurant's growing reputation. She would describe warmly and with genuine pride how her own mother had taught Antonio to cook traditional family recipes, framing the restaurant's entire existence as an extension of this specific culinary lineage, a narrative that, while genuinely touching in its own way, consistently, systematically minimized or entirely omitted my own foundational role in the business's actual operational and financial success. I remember one particular local newspaper feature, published during our restaurant's 4th year, a warm, well-intentioned profile piece that quoted Carmela extensively describing Antonio's culinary journey from her own mother's kitchen table to his eventual restaurant, mentioning me only briefly, in a single sentence describing me as Antonio's wife, who helps manage the front of house. I remember reading that article with a specific quiet discomfort, understanding that the description technically wasn't false, I did, after all, manage our front of house operations, but that its framing entirely erased my equal ownership stake and my substantial role in every other aspect of the business's actual success. I mentioned this discomfort to Antonio at the time, and he reassured me, easily, that his mother simply talked that way about everything, a reassurance I accepted at the time without pushing further. I want to be honest that this particular pattern repeated itself, in smaller variations, across numerous other public moments throughout our marriage. Industry award ceremonies where Antonio was invited to speak while I attended as simply his accompanying spouse, culinary conference panels that featured Antonio discussing his restaurant's success without any parallel invitation extended to discuss the operational and financial strategy that had made that success actually sustainable. I want to be honest that I noticed each of these moments individually, felt a small, specific sting each time, and consistently chose, for the sake of preserving both our marriage and our professional partnership's smooth function, not to make an issue of any single instance, understanding, in hindsight, that this accumulated pattern of small omissions eventually built the exact public narrative Antonio's family would later attempt to leverage against me. I want to be honest that I rarely corrected this narrative directly during our marriage, understanding it, at the time, as simply the kind of sentimental, imprecise family storytelling that happens in most families, rather than anything I felt was worth the friction of formally challenging. I was, after all, still Antonio's wife, still genuinely deeply involved in the restaurant's daily operations, and the specific legal structure of our actual ownership felt, at the time, like a technical detail rather than something requiring active, ongoing public assertion. Dante's relationship to this narrative was, I want to note, somewhat different from his mother's, though ultimately just as consequential. Dante worked, throughout most of our marriage, as a financial analyst at a regional bank, and he occasionally offered informal advice regarding the restaurant's growth, advice I genuinely valued given his professional expertise. But Dante also harbored, I came to understand much later, a specific quiet resentment toward his own perceived exclusion from the restaurant's success. Having watched his older brother build something genuinely significant while his own career, though respectable, never achieved the same public recognition within our extended family and community. I remember, in the years following our restaurant's growing success, occasional comments from Dante at family gatherings, comments that carried a specific, dry edge whenever he discussed my own operational role, jokes about how someone has to keep Antonio's creative genius grounded in actual math, delivered with enough humor to avoid seeming genuinely dismissive, but with an undertone I recognized, even then, as carrying real, if carefully concealed, resentment about his own more modest professional trajectory. I understand now, with the clarity of everything that eventually happened, that Dante's later willingness to actively support Antonio's aggressive legal strategy during our divorce likely stemmed, at least in part, from this long-standing, quietly accumulated resentment, a desire to see his own family's narrative about Antonio's singular genius finally, formally validated, regardless of what that validation might cost me. I want to tell you about how our marriage began to deteriorate, because understanding this specific decline matters for understanding exactly how Antonio and his family's minimization of my role eventually transformed from casual, imprecise family narrative into something considerably more deliberate and consequential. Our marriage began experiencing genuine strain approximately 6 years into the restaurant's operation. Strain that emerged, I think, from the particular pressure of two people working such demanding, intertwined professional lives together while also attempting to maintain a genuine, healthy marriage. A combination that proves difficult for many couples in similar circumstances, regardless of how successful their shared business eventually becomes. I remember the specific texture of this decline, gradual rather than sudden, the accumulated exhaustion of years spent working alongside each other at every waking hour beginning to erode the easier, more spontaneous intimacy we'd shared during our earlier dating years. Our conversations increasingly centered entirely on the restaurant's operational logistics, staffing schedules, supplier negotiations, upcoming menu changes, until it sometimes felt, during our rare quiet evenings together, that we had genuinely forgotten how to discuss anything beyond the shared business that had once been simply one part of a fuller, more balanced relationship. I suggested, more than once during this period, that we consider working with a marriage counselor, suggestions Antonio initially agreed to somewhat reluctantly, attending perhaps 4 or 5 sessions before consistently finding reasons, usually related to restaurant scheduling conflicts, to postpone further appointments. I want to tell you about the specific moment I first recognized that Antonio's family's long-standing narrative about the restaurant was beginning to shift from simple imprecision into something considerably more strategic, because it represents the actual beginning of everything that eventually unfolded during our divorce. Approximately 8 months before Antonio formally filed for divorce, during a family dinner I now understand was likely already informed by conversations Antonio had been having privately with his mother and brother about our marriage's likely ending, Carmela made a comment that struck me, even at the time, as carrying a specific, deliberate weight beyond her usual sentimental framing. I remember that particular dinner clearly, held at Carmela's own house rather than at the restaurant itself. The four of us, Antonio, myself, Carmela, and Dante, gathered around her dining table for what I understood, at the time, as simply an ordinary monthly family gathering. I remember noticing, in retrospect with far more significance than I attributed to it that evening, a particular quality of careful attention passing between Antonio and his mother throughout the meal, brief glances and small nods that I dismissed, at the time, as simply ordinary family communication rather than evidence of conversations I wasn't yet aware were happening. She mentioned, during this dinner, in a tone that felt carefully casual rather than genuinely offhand, that she had been thinking about the restaurant's eventual succession, specifically discussing how proud she was that Antonio would someday pass the business down to his own children, a framing that entirely excluded any acknowledgement of my equal ownership stake, and that struck me, in that specific moment, as considerably more pointed than her usual imprecise sentimentality. I remember asking directly whether she meant our children, given that Antonio and I had discussed at various points throughout our marriage our own hopes of eventually starting a family, and I remember the specific, brief hesitation before she clarified, somewhat awkwardly, that of course she meant our shared children, a correction that felt, even as she offered it, considerably less confident than her original framing had been. I want to tell you about the actual divorce filing, and the specific strategy Antonio and his family employed regarding the restaurant, because understanding this strategy in full detail matters enormously for everything I eventually needed to do to protect my legitimate ownership stake. Antonio filed for divorce approximately 2 months after that particular family dinner, and within the same week, I received a formal letter from his newly retained attorney, an aggressive, unfamiliar firm, rather than our restaurant's longtime business attorney who had originally helped us form our LLC. This letter characterized my role in the restaurant's operations, throughout its entire 8-year history, as that of an operational manager, rather than an equal owner, and proposed a settlement that would have transferred my ownership stake to Antonio for a fraction of the restaurant's actual current market value, based on what the letter characterized as my limited capital contribution to the business's original formation. I remember opening that letter alone in my own kitchen, the same kitchen where Antonio and I had spent countless evenings years earlier sketching our original business plan together, and feeling a specific disorienting vertigo as I read language so thoroughly, clinically dismissive of 8 years of my own documented foundational work. I read it 3 times before I could fully process what it actually represented, not simply the end of my marriage, which I had already begun preparing myself for emotionally, but a coordinated, deliberate attempt to formally erase my legal ownership of something I had helped build from its very first day. I remember calling a close friend that same evening, someone entirely outside our restaurant industry who could offer perspective uncomplicated by any professional relationship to Antonio or his family, and I remember articulating, out loud for the first time, exactly how deeply this letter's language had wounded me, considerably more than the divorce filing itself had. My friend, listening carefully, asked me a simple, clarifying question that I've returned to often since. She asked, "Sofia, do you actually have proof that contradicts what this letter claims?" I told her yes, immediately, thinking of our formation documents sitting in our home safe. She said, "Then this letter isn't actually a threat. It's just a story someone is telling before they've checked whether the story matches the facts." That reframing, simple as it sounds, helped me move, within days, from raw emotional devastation into the kind of clear, methodical planning that would eventually prove so decisive. I want to describe my reaction to receiving this letter because it represented, in a single document, the formal legal codification of exactly the minimization I had allowed to persist informally through Antonio's family's casual narrative for years without ever feeling the need to actively challenge it. I retained my own attorney immediately, a careful, experienced woman named Diane Kessler who specialized specifically in complex business asset division within divorce proceedings, and I brought her, during our first meeting, the same fundamental piece of evidence that would eventually prove entirely decisive throughout the remainder of this dispute. Our original LLC formation documents, filed with the state 8 years earlier, clearly, unambiguously listing Antonio and me as equal 50% owners, along with 8 years of tax returns consistently reflecting this same equal ownership structure, and payroll records demonstrating my own substantial, ongoing operational role throughout the business's entire history. I remember that first meeting with Diane clearly, her office considerably calmer and more reassuring than the anxious, disoriented state I arrived in, still holding the folder of formation documents I'd retrieved from our home safe the previous evening. She reviewed each document methodically, occasionally making brief notes, and I remember the specific, steadying relief I felt watching her expression shift from professional neutrality to something closer to genuine confidence as she worked through the clear, unambiguous paper trail I'd brought her. She told me, directly, that Antonio's attorney's characterization of my role, however aggressively worded, would likely struggle considerably against documentation this consistent and thorough, though she was also honest that we would need to move quickly and decisively to prevent Antonio from taking any further unilateral action regarding the business while our formal proceedings continued. I want to tell you about the specific weeks that followed because they required me to navigate an increasingly hostile business environment, given that Antonio, in the immediate aftermath of filing for divorce, had also begun taking concrete steps to functionally exclude me from the restaurant's daily operations, despite my clear, documented equal ownership. Approximately 3 weeks after the divorce filing, I arrived at the restaurant for my usual morning shift, managing our weekly vendor deliveries and reviewing our previous week's financial statements, only to discover that our restaurant's security system access code had been changed and that my key no longer opened the building's rear entrance, the entrance I had personally used every single working day for 8 years. I remember standing in that alley behind our restaurant, the same alley I'd walked through thousands of times over 8 years, holding a key that suddenly, inexplicably no longer worked, our vendor's delivery truck idling nearby as the driver waited, confused for me to let him in with our usual weekly shipment. I remember the specific disorienting shock of that moment, the physical impossibility of accessing a building I had helped design, furnish, and operate since before it ever served a single customer, standing locked outside it like a stranger. I want to describe the specific conversation that followed because it represents, I think, the moment when Antonio's family's long-standing narrative fully transitioned from imprecise sentiment into deliberate, active exclusion. I called Antonio directly, standing outside our own restaurant's locked rear entrance, and he explained, in a tone I found genuinely startling given 8 years of shared partnership, that his attorney had advised him to protect the business's operational continuity during our divorce proceedings, a characterization that positioned my own exclusion from a business I had co-founded and equally owned as some kind of reasonable protective business decision rather than what it actually represented, a deliberate attempt to functionally push me out before the legal proceedings could formally establish exactly what my ownership stake actually entitled me to. I remember the specific disorienting quality of that phone call, hearing my husband of 9 years, the man I had built something genuinely significant alongside for nearly a decade, speak to me in the careful, distant language of someone reciting talking points prepared by an attorney, rather than someone genuinely engaging with the person he'd shared this entire journey with. I asked him directly whether he understood that locking me out of a business I equally owned was likely to be viewed by any court as a significant overreach rather than any legitimate protective measure, and he responded only that his attorney had advised him this was the appropriate course of action, a response that told me, more clearly than anything else could have, exactly how thoroughly he had already outsourced his own judgment to a legal strategy specifically designed to minimize what I would ultimately receive. I want to tell you about how I responded to this situation, because I think the specific approach I took, working carefully through legal channels rather than attempting any kind of dramatic, confrontational return to the restaurant itself, mattered enormously for how effectively this entire dispute was eventually resolved. Diane immediately filed an emergency motion with the court, specifically citing my documented equal ownership status and requesting immediate injunctive relief to restore my access to the business and its financial records. A motion supported by the clear, unambiguous LLC formation documents and 8 years of consistent tax filings that left essentially no room for Antonio's attorney to credibly argue that my ownership stake was anything other than exactly what it had always formally legally been. I remember the specific anxious days between filing that emergency motion and our eventual court date, roughly 2 weeks during which I stayed with a close friend rather than returning to the home Antonio and I had shared, understanding that some distance felt necessary while this dispute worked its way through the legal system. I remember Diane calling me periodically during those weeks with updates, explaining the procedural steps involved, preparing me carefully for what to expect during the actual hearing, and reassuring me, consistently, that the strength of our documentation gave us genuinely strong grounds for a favorable, relatively swift ruling. I want to tell you about the specific court hearing where this motion was addressed, because it represents, I think, the actual turning point where the truth of my genuine equal partnership finally became impossible for Antonio's family to continue minimizing, even informally, within our broader social and professional community. The judge, reviewing the straightforward, unambiguous LLC formation documents alongside 8 years of tax filings and payroll records clearly demonstrating my substantial ongoing operational role, granted the emergency motion within a single hearing, restoring my full access to the business and its financial records, and specifically noting in her ruling that Antonio's characterization of my role as merely operational management was directly contradicted by the clear, consistent legal and financial records spanning the entire 8 years of the business's operation. I remember sitting in that courtroom, Diane beside me with our carefully organized binder of formation documents and financial records, watching the judge review each page methodically before delivering her ruling in a tone that carried no particular drama, simply the calm, measured authority of someone stating what the documented record made entirely, unambiguously clear. Antonio sat across the room with his attorney, his expression carefully neutral throughout the proceeding, though I noticed, watching him, a specific tightness in his jaw that suggested he understood, even before the ruling was formally announced, exactly how this particular hearing was likely to conclude. I remember specifically the judge's closing remarks before formally issuing her order, a brief but pointed observation that the court found it notable that 8 consecutive years of consistent tax filings, payroll documentation, and formation paperwork all told an identical, unambiguous story about ownership, one that only became disputed at the precise moment a divorce filing made that dispute financially advantageous to one party. I remember the specific, quiet satisfaction of hearing a neutral, credentialed authority articulate exactly what I had felt, privately, throughout those difficult 3 weeks, that the truth doesn't actually change simply because circumstances make someone wish it had. I want to tell you about returning to the restaurant following this ruling, because it represented, for me, a genuinely significant moment of vindication. Though one I want to describe honestly, without exaggerating its emotional simplicity, given how complicated and painful the broader context of our divorce genuinely remained. I arrived at the restaurant the following morning with the court's order in hand, along with Diane accompanying me to ensure the transition proceeded without further incident. I remember our staff's specific reaction, several of our longtime servers and kitchen staff visibly relieved to see me, having genuinely worried, in my 3-week absence, about the restaurant's stability and about my own well-being given the sudden, unexplained nature of my absence from a business I had helped run for 8 years. I remember one of our longtime servers, Maria, a woman who had worked with us since our very first year, approaching me quietly in the dining room shortly after I arrived that morning, her eyes bright with unshed tears, telling me she'd been afraid I'd simply decided to leave the business entirely, that no one on staff had been given any real explanation beyond Antonio's brief, vague mention that I was taking some time away. I remember the specific comfort of that reunion, understanding, watching our staff's genuine relief, that whatever Antonio's family had attempted to construct regarding my role in the business, the people who actually worked alongside me every single day had never once doubted the genuine, substantial nature of my contribution. Several other staff members approached me throughout that first morning back, each with their own small, specific expressions of relief and support. Our head server mentioning that the reservation system had been in genuine disarray during my absence. Our kitchen manager quietly confirming that several vendor payments had fallen behind schedule without my usual oversight. Small, practical details that, taken together, offered their own quiet, unintentional corroboration of exactly how substantial my ongoing operational role had always actually been. I remember feeling, throughout that entire morning, a specific kind of vindication that had nothing to do with the court's formal ruling and everything to do with the genuine, lived experience of the people who had actually witnessed my contribution firsthand, day after day, for 8 consistent years. I want to tell you about the specific conversation I eventually had with Carmela, Antonio's mother, because I think it represents an important, if imperfect, resolution to the specific narrative she had maintained for so many years regarding the restaurant's true ownership. Carmela requested a meeting with me approximately 2 months after the court's ruling during the ongoing broader divorce proceedings, and I agreed to meet her, understanding that whatever our future relationship might eventually look like, some direct conversation about her long-standing characterization of the restaurant felt necessary before any genuine resolution could occur. I remember that meeting taking place at a quiet cafe neither of us had any particular history with, Carmela arriving visibly nervous in a way I had genuinely never witnessed from her throughout 8 years of knowing her, her usual confident, warmly assertive manner replaced by something considerably more tentative and uncertain. She told me during that meeting that she had genuinely believed, throughout most of our marriage, that her framing of the restaurant as Antonio's legacy was simply an affectionate way of honoring her own mother's culinary influence, rather than any deliberate attempt to minimize my actual ownership and contribution. But she also acknowledged, with what I recognized as genuine, if belated honesty, that in the months following Antonio's decision to file for divorce, she had specifically encouraged him to pursue the aggressive ownership strategy his new attorney proposed, understanding, even as she encouraged it, that this strategy directly contradicted the actual legal and financial reality of our partnership. I asked her, directly, why, if she understood the strategy contradicted the actual truth, she had encouraged Antonio to pursue it anyway. She was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer, before answering, with what struck me as her most genuinely honest admission of that entire conversation. I think watching my son's marriage end, some part of me wanted to believe there was still something meaningful left for him to hold on to completely, something that couldn't also be divided and taken away the same way everything else felt like it was being divided and taken away. I know now that wasn't a fair thing to want, especially not at your expense. I'm sorry, Sofia. I really am. I appreciated that admission considerably more than I expected to, understanding it as a genuine, if painfully late, reckoning with exactly what her encouragement had actually cost me. I want to tell you about how the broader financial resolution of our divorce eventually unfolded, because the restaurant's ownership dispute, once definitively settled through the court's initial ruling, significantly shaped the remainder of our overall settlement negotiations. Given the clear, undisputed evidence of my equal 50% ownership, Antonio's attorney eventually abandoned the initial strategy of characterizing my role as merely operational, and our subsequent negotiations focused instead on the practical question of how to handle our shared ownership going forward, given that neither of us particularly wanted to continue operating a restaurant together while simultaneously divorcing. I remember the specific weeks of negotiation that followed the court's initial ruling. Diane working carefully with Antonio's attorney to arrange for an independent, neutral valuation of the restaurant's current market worth, a process that required examining 8 years of financial records, current lease terms, equipment condition, and the restaurant's ongoing revenue trajectory, all conducted by a specialist with no prior relationship to either of us, specifically to ensure the resulting valuation would withstand any further dispute. I remember waiting, during those weeks, for the specialist's final report, with a particular kind of anxious anticipation, understanding that this single document would likely determine the actual financial shape of the next chapter of my own life. I ultimately agreed to sell my 50% ownership stake to Antonio, but at a valuation reflecting the restaurant's genuine current market worth, professionally appraised by an independent restaurant valuation specialist, rather than the significantly discounted figure his attorney had originally proposed, a settlement that provided me with genuine, fair compensation for 8 years of substantial, foundational work, building the business into something genuinely successful. I remember the specific afternoon we finalized that settlement, sitting across a conference table from Antonio for what would be one of our final direct interactions before our divorce was fully finalized, both of us considerably more subdued than the aggressive posturing of those earlier months might have suggested. He told me, briefly, before we left that final meeting, that he genuinely regretted how the entire ownership dispute had unfolded, though he stopped short of fully acknowledging the deliberate strategy his attorney and his mother had encouraged him to pursue. I accepted that partial acknowledgement for what it was, understanding that complete accountability might simply never fully arrive, and that my own peace with everything that happened couldn't reasonably depend on receiving it. I want to be honest with you about how I feel now, nearly 2 years removed from that initial court hearing. I do not feel simple, uncomplicated triumph, the way you might expect from a story that resolves this clearly through documented legal proof. I feel instead something considerably more complicated, genuine grief for a marriage and a shared professional dream that ultimately didn't survive, alongside real hard-won satisfaction that the actual truth of my equal partnership was never able to be permanently erased or minimized, regardless of how persistently Antonio's family had worked, informally and then formally, to reshape that narrative in their own favor. There are ordinary moments now that still carry unexpected weight. A former regular customer from our original restaurant occasionally finds their way to my new location, mentioning, sometimes, how surprised they were to learn I'd opened a place entirely of my own, having always simply assumed, given Antonio's public visibility as the restaurant's chef, that I had been helping him out, rather than equally building something alongside him. I no longer feel the specific sting these comments once carried during our marriage. I simply correct the record, gently, explaining my actual history, and I watch most times genuine surprise and reconsideration cross their expression. Small, individual moments of the broader public narrative finally, gradually catching up with the actual truth. A local food writer, working on a feature about women-owned restaurants in our region last year, interviewed me at length about my professional journey. And I remember the specific, quiet satisfaction of finally having my full history properly, accurately documented in print. My own name and my own 8 years of foundational work in the original restaurant's success finally given the same weight and specificity that Carmela's version of events had always denied me. The published article, when it finally appeared, described my role clearly and completely, evidence that the truth, once properly asserted and documented, eventually finds its way into the public record it always deserved. I still think occasionally about that first walkthrough of our original empty storefront, the two of us young and hopeful and entirely unaware of everything that 8 years would eventually bring. I don't regret those years, even now, even knowing how they ultimately ended. I built something genuinely significant during that time, developed skills and professional relationships and a reputation within our local culinary community that no divorce settlement, however contentious, could ever have taken from me. What Antonio and his family eventually attempted to erase was never actually the work itself, work too substantial and too well documented to genuinely disappear. What they attempted to erase was simply the public acknowledgement of that work, and I think, ultimately, that distinction matters considerably. Understanding that the actual foundation I built during those 8 years remained entirely, structurally intact throughout the entire dispute, waiting only for the proper documentation to finally, publicly reassert what had always, quietly been true. I used a significant portion of my settlement to open my own restaurant, a smaller, more intimate space specializing in the specific style of Mediterranean cuisine I had always personally loved, a venture I now run entirely independently, with full, unambiguous ownership and control that no one has ever once attempted to minimize or question. I remember the specific day I signed the lease for my new location, sitting alone in my attorney's office rather than sharing that moment with any partner, and feeling, in that solitary signature, a particular kind of clean, uncomplicated pride that felt genuinely different from anything I'd experienced during our original restaurant's formation, precisely because this new venture belonged entirely, unambiguously to me alone, with no possibility of anyone eventually attempting to selectively rewrite the history of exactly whose work had built it. I named the restaurant myself, designed the menu concept myself, hired every member of staff myself, and I take a specific, quiet satisfaction now in signing every document, every lease renewal, every business filing, entirely under my own name, with no shared ownership structure for anyone to later dispute or minimize. Several of our original restaurant's longtime staff members, including Maria, eventually followed me to this new venture, a transition I hadn't specifically solicited, but that touched me considerably, understanding it as further, quiet confirmation of exactly whose leadership and vision they had genuinely valued throughout those original 8 years, regardless of whatever narrative Antonio's family had attempted to construct. I remember the specific morning Maria first mentioned she was considering the move, finding me during a quiet afternoon lull at my new location, telling me simply, "I always knew who actually ran that kitchen's business, Sofia. I want to work somewhere that says so honestly." I still think about that comment often, understanding it as one of the clearest, most genuine forms of vindication I received throughout this entire experience, offered not through any legal document or court ruling, but through the simple, considered choice of someone who had witnessed the truth firsthand, and decided, freely, where she wanted to invest her own continued loyalty. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Formal documentation of your genuine contribution matters enormously, even when informal family or social narratives seem, in the moment, too imprecise or sentimental to feel worth actively correcting. I allowed Antonio's family's casual minimization of my role to persist informally for years, understanding it as simply imprecise, affectionate storytelling, and I am genuinely grateful that the actual legal structure we established at the very beginning of our partnership remained clear and unambiguous enough to eventually correct that narrative when it finally mattered most. Here is a second truth I have carried with me since that first court hearing. People's narratives about your contribution can shift considerably once circumstances change, even when those narratives had seemed for years like harmless sentiment rather than active strategy. Carmela's framing of the restaurant as Antonio's legacy felt, for most of our marriage, like affectionate imprecision. It took the specific pressure of divorce for that same framing to reveal its potential to be deployed, quite deliberately, as a strategic minimization of my actual documented rights. Here is a third truth. Building something genuinely equal requires more than simply doing equal work. It requires ensuring that the formal legal structure of your partnership actually reflects that equal contribution clearly enough to survive any future dispute, regardless of how unlikely such a dispute might feel during the genuinely collaborative early years of building something together. Here is a fourth truth. Quiet vindication does not require an elaborate, dramatic confrontation to feel complete. I did not storm back into that restaurant demanding public acknowledgement of my role in front of our entire staff. I simply returned quietly with the court's clear order in hand, allowing the documented truth to speak considerably more effectively than any confrontation ever could have. Here is a fifth truth, one I didn't fully understand until I opened my own restaurant afterward. Reclaiming what was rightfully yours and rebuilding something entirely new for yourself are not mutually exclusive paths toward healing. I could have simply accepted my settlement and moved on to some entirely unrelated career, and I think that would have been a genuinely reasonable choice for many people in my position. But choosing to build something new, entirely under my own name, in the same industry where my contributions had once been so persistently minimized, has given me a specific, ongoing sense of closure that I don't think any settlement alone could have fully provided. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Sometimes the people who most persistently minimize our genuine contributions are not acting out of any particularly calculated cruelty, but out of a comfortable, unexamined narrative that simply never required correction until circumstances made that correction suddenly, urgently necessary. Recognizing the difference between harmless imprecision and active minimization, and knowing exactly when and how to formally assert the documented truth, is, I have come to believe, one of the most valuable forms of self-protection any of us can build into our most significant professional and personal partnerships. That is my story. 8 years of genuinely equal partnership, 3 weeks of deliberate exclusion, and one set of clear, unambiguous ownership documents that finally, undeniably proved exactly whose name had always actually been on that restaurant. I think sometimes about that very first day Antonio and I walked into our empty, unrenovated storefront together, before either of us had any real certainty that our shared dream would ever actually become the successful, respected restaurant it eventually did. I remember standing in that empty space, dust and construction debris still scattered across the floor, both of us imagining, together, exactly what it might someday become. I don't regret that day, even now, understanding that the genuine partnership we built together during those early years was entirely real. Whatever complicated, painful things eventually happened to end it. I think it's possible to hold both truths at once, that something was genuinely, equally built together, and that its true ownership was later, quietly, deliberately challenged by the very people who once celebrated its success alongside me. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that your genuine contributions deserve to be formally documented and protected, I would love to hear from you. Tell me in your own words about a time your own role in something significant was quietly minimized by people who should have known better. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story.